Welcome, everybody. I guess it's 12:30, and so we're live. Thank you for joining us for this session of Florida Sea Grant's National Seafood Month Florida Aquatalk program. My name is Holly Abeels, and I'm the Florida Sea Grant Extension Agent for University of Florida IFAS Extension in Brevard County. And we're here today in beautiful Tortoise Island and in Satellite Beach, Florida. And we're going to be talking today about oyster gardening. And oyster gardening is a program that started here in Brevard late 2013, early 2014. And it was the Brevard Zoo, the Brevard County Natural Resources Department, and myself got together to discuss and talk about what oyster gardening might look like here in Brevard and whether or not we thought oyster gardening would be feasible. And the reason why we wanted to bring oysters back to the Indian River Lagoon is because in 2011, we started having many algae blooms. We had a brown tide and then a green tide, and the health of the lagoon was visibly being seen as declining because of these large-scale algae blooms. And in Brevard County, we have lost a lot of our filter feeders, or shellfish filter feeders, like oysters and clams, over many, many years. And because we don't have a healthy oyster population, we can't have more oysters and more oyster reefs grow and thrive without actually seeding and putting oysters into the environment onto restored reefs. So we talked about oyster gardening and decided that we would give it a go, see what we could do. And so that first year in 2014 is when the program got it started and its inception. And in order to have the program be successful, we needed oyster gardeners like my friend Craig here to get on board. Hello, Craig. Craig
Hello.
Wallace is a resident here in Tortoise Island, and he is a resident oyster gardener. And so him and many, many others came on board and decided that they wanted to become part of the oyster gardening program. So what an oyster gardener does is they actually take oysters, small baby oysters called oyster spat, and the oysters are put in these, what we call habitats. So they're just little cages to hold the oysters and to keep them protected from predators and anything else that might be wanting to eat the oysters. And the oyster gardeners keep the oysters for about 6 to 9 months. They leave them off of their docks. So all of our oyster gardeners have docks or some way, shape, or form that they can hang the oysters in the water column and allow the oysters to grow and feed over a period of time, usually 6 to 9 months. And then after that time, the oyster gardeners bring the oysters back. There's actually a kind of a coming home party, they call it, where the oysters are brought to a location where the Brevard Zoo actually creates and puts in a constructed oyster reef. And so the Brevard Zoo is the main organization here in Brevard County that organizes that program. And if you want to learn more about oyster gardening and the Brevard Zoo's work, you can go to their website, restoreourshores.org. And they're always looking for volunteers, both to be oyster gardeners, to help in creating and putting in oyster reefs. They also are now including living shoreline work in Brevard County, where they're actually putting in plantings. So they're including both plants and oysters for restoration, and then they also have some areas where they're just putting in plants for the restoration. So it's been a very successful program here in Brevard County. We actually have, the zoo has trained over 1,200 oyster gardeners here in Brevard County, and they've put out approximately 500,000 live oysters into our Indian River Lagoon, the Brevard County portion of the Indian River Lagoon. I believe they have about 8 reefs that they've already created over the past 4 years that this program has been going on, and they're putting in more and more reefs every year, including here in Tortoise Island. They'll be putting in a reef around the area.
Looking forward to it.
Yes. So I wanted to turn it over quickly to Craig so he can talk about what it means for him to be an oyster gardener and some of the work that he has been doing as an oyster gardener.
So let me give you a little bit of background. I moved here about 3 years ago, and right before the big fish kill, And so when I moved in, our canals were just coated with dead fish, and immediately I said, I'm in trouble, because I had just invested a lot of money in my house here. And so I started immediately looking for things I could do to try to clean up this problem. And one of the first things I ran across was the Oyster Gardener program with the zoo. And I'm not a biologist, and I didn't really know much about it, but the zoo educated me, and they have a wonderful training program. And so I said, okay, I'm going to sign up and see if I can have some impact here. Well, not only do we have some impact here, but in Tortoise Island, we were able to get 50 residents here in our small community actually becoming oyster gardeners also. And so we've got a nice little community here, and the word is spreading that this is an easy thing to do. It's a fun thing to do. Kids love it, because we have a lot of parents coming to us with their kids, and they're talking about it in school. And so we've really got kind of a social group going, and it's been a fun thing to do. But I think one of my biggest goals is trying to spread the word, get people more aware of what's going on in the lagoon and what they can do to fix it. So this has been a fun experience. I've got some pictures here if you want to.
Yes, of course.
I want to show. This was my first year of oyster gardening. These are my babies. And so what we start with, as Holly was saying, is you get a bag of oysters like this, and you don't really see much of anything. There's just a few little brown spots on there, and that's actually the egg, or the baby oyster. And then as they start growing, after a week or so, you start to see they actually start to take shape, and they actually start looking like oysters. I know you probably can't see it, but as you get down to here, where this is like 5 weeks out and 10 weeks out, you can actually start to see these little the shells starting to form, and they start to look like oysters, especially here once you get out at 23 weeks, which is getting close to the end of their nursing cycle here in our habitats. But these are the and this is what they looked like. This little bag here started out with those, and it ended up with all of these oysters. So this was a really good year. It had like almost 2,000 oysters. So I want to give you, in addition to this, so here's where we hang them off the dock, and they just sit in the water, and we bring them out once a week and kind of hose them off, and that's it. And then here's where they end up. And as Holly was saying, they build the oyster reefs from them, and so this is actually where my oysters ended up in the lagoon, in this oyster reef. And then also, and this is kind of cool too, every time we open up the habitats, you find something new popping out. I mean, there's like, I just pulled out some shrimp that were in my habitat, and there's all kinds of little fish growing in there. But somebody actually found seahorse, which is, and we get crabs and all kinds of stuff. So it's pretty cool. And so this was where the zoo came out, and they actually did a training program here at Tortoise Island. And we had like about 40, 50 people here that came out for that training, and the kids were even participated in it, and they made, so they're making up the cages. Let me just show you a quick example of what the cage looks like with some oysters in it.
So this is the actual habitat that is used, and the zoo gets basically this mesh in large bundles, and then they have this kind of diagram that they use to kind of cut it up and create this actual design. So these are what we call oyster habitats. So it's a habitat for our oysters to keep them protected until we can put them out on the reef. And the zoo collected oysters a couple weeks ago, I think you were saying, in July, I think it was.
Yeah.
And so Craig held some back so that we can take a look at them and look at the oysters. So here is a beautiful oyster that we have right here. Get a little bit closer. So this is a single oyster, and again, like Craig was saying, they start out very, very small, oyster spat, smaller than a thumbnail or a fingernail, and they grow this large over many, many months. Because it's so warm here in Florida, oysters grow year-round, and they're feeding year-round, And so they can get a very good size very, very shortly. If you listened to Eric's talk last week, I think he was saying how oysters can get to market size where you would actually harvest oysters for food, within less than a year if they have a good food source and the weather's been kind to them.
And here's typically what you're going to find when they start growing. They grow in clusters like this, so that the ones that were originally on that on the host shell have actually grown out and become, they cluster together like this, and that's how they end up on the reef too. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, and we have lots of barnacles and tube worms on these oysters, and that's perfectly natural. That's what you're going to see on a typical oyster reef once they get on the reef. But our gardeners are kind of tasked to watch their oysters over the period of time that they have them. Craig just said that he cleaned his habitat and his oysters, just earlier, and so they could get their debut here on Facebook Live. So we do ask our gardeners to clean their habitats, to take out any predators that might have gone in the habitat. So we have our oyster toadfish that love oysters, and they love to get in the habitats to eat the baby oysters.
Here's an example of what happens. Every once in a while they do, so that's a cleaned out shell, whether it's a crab or fish or whatever got in there, and was able to make a meal of it. But most of them, because of the mesh, we keep out the predators pretty well.
Yeah. And so the goal with having them in this habitat, again, predators can't get to them. They're in the water column safe. They're feeding constantly. So when the zoo actually gets them to build on the oyster reef, they're at a very good size where they can survive and thrive on the oyster reefs in Brevard County.
Hey, someone wants to know if these are wild set.
They are not. That's a great question. So the oysters that we have here in Brevard County are not wild set. So like I mentioned before, we have lost a lot of our oysters and oyster reefs here in Brevard County. And because of that, we actually have to give the oyster gardeners oysters that have been raised and spawned in a hatchery. And so we actually work with the Florida Oceanographic Society, and the Brevard Zoo collects adult oysters here in Brevard, and then they ship the oysters and bring them to the Florida Oceanographic Society, and then they have a hatchery there where they spawn the oysters, and then the larvae set on oyster shell, and then after a couple of weeks, the Brevard Zoo actually gets those oysters back. So it'd be an oyster shell with oyster spat attached to it, and then they give them out to the oyster gardeners. So we don't, unfortunately, have a good population of wild oysters here in Brevard County in order to have natural reefs, but our hope with this program is that with building these oyster reefs, we'll eventually have a good population where oysters will naturally be spawning in our waters, and they'll be continuing to seed the reefs that we've built and potentially creating new reefs. Great question. So that is like the end of the introduction to oyster gardening. So yeah, Craig and I are both willing to take any questions that you might have. So Craig, can you tell me again how long you've been an oyster gardener?
So this is be going into my third year.
Right.
We're going to be getting our spat, then the baby's second week in November. So we're looking forward to that. The first year was phenomenal in terms of the number of oysters we got out of it. Last year wasn't quite so good because we had the brown tide and a number of other things going on, but hoping for a good yield this year.
Great.
Someone wants to know, what are the requirements to get involved in this program?
So to be an oyster gardener, you have to have waterfront property that has a dock or some other structure that you can actually hang the oyster habitats from. So they do hang off of a dock, and basically the time and the willingness to be part of the program. So like I said, usually oyster gardeners have their habitats for about 6 to 9 months. So, and there is a commitment of just taking care of them and cleaning the habitats, and then being able to be available to return the habitats. Anything else as an oyster gardener that you have to do?
Basically they ask you to clean them off once a week. Basically just hose them down, get the real muck off them if there is. And I use that as my opportunity to look at the oysters and take pictures like I showed you, and you kind of bond with the oysters after a bit. So it's kind of a fun experience.
Yeah, and there is another opportunity where you could be an oyster buddy. So if someone doesn't have a waterfront property or a dock and they still want to be part of the program, we don't expect oyster gardeners to be at their home, for the whole entire 9 months. People go on vacation or they have other obligations. So oyster buddies are there to be able to go to places where maybe gardeners, can't take care of their oysters for a week or two. And so we also have that program. And then, of course, being able to go when the zoo is actually building oyster reefs and be part of putting the reefs out. That's pretty a work-intensive project, putting the reefs, actually creating the reefs, and all the things that go on before then, making the oyster bag. So there's lots of opportunities to get involved in the program. Even if can't become an oyster gardener because you don't have waterfront property, there's lots of opportunities.
Hi, so Dorothy wants to know, can you garden to eat the oysters in Florida?
Not for our program. So our oysters, that's a great question, Dorothy. Our oysters are not for eating, and actually in the presentation that we first created, and that still is given to potential oyster gardeners, we tell them that they can't eat their oysters. There are other programs across the country where oyster gardening is meant for people to actually consume their oysters, but our program here in Brevard County is for these oysters to be put on restored oyster reefs. So they're just used for restoration.
Maya is asking if there are other programs throughout the state, or is it just Brevard County?
Maya, that's a great question. I believe in Northeast Florida, they are trying and thinking about starting an oyster gardening program. I know that in St. Lucie County, I think that there has been some discussions for oyster gardening program. And those are the only two that I'm aware of as far as other oyster gardening or other places in Florida where oyster gardening is done. We're not lucky in here in Brevard that we don't have natural oyster reefs, and we can't just put shell out for oysters to come set naturally. Oyster gardening was created because we have to be able to put oysters out onto reef. A lot of places in Florida, you just put material out and the oysters come, they find it. So,
Becca, this is a question for Craig. Becca wants to know, what is your favorite part of oyster gardening?
Initially, I thought it was just cool to see the growth phase from the real baby, and they grow fairly quickly. So every week I'd come out here and pull them out, and it was just really cool to see how much they had grown. But what I've found over time here, over the years that I've done this, that the most rewarding part of this is actually, I won't say getting to know my neighbors, but actually interacting with other people that are oyster gardeners that have come to enjoy it. And watching the kids, when I have my grandchildren, in my case, come stay with us, the kids always want to see, they want to see what the oysters look like. And so as soon as they get out of the car, they're running down to the dock to see what the oysters look like. So that's pretty cool. So just spreading the word has become a part of my, goal going forward here too.
So Dorothy wants to know, in the event of a storm, a severe storm or a hurricane, do you have to remove the habitat? You have to take it out of the water?
go ahead.
I would say it's probably a good idea. One, because of just the tidal rise we get during a storm, your habitat might no longer be where you thought it was going to be. Plus, you've got waves and a lot of flow. Fortunately, typically the hurricane season, at least when we actually have the hurricanes, is usually September to November time period, and that's not a period in which we're growing the oysters ourselves. Now, they'd be out on the reefs, where that can be a problem and has been a problem, where they get damaged on the reefs. But they specifically scheduled it, and I was also going to point out that the training, what they do is that the training for new oyster gardeners occurs during the summer months, because that's when they're not that's when you're not growing them. So you get the training during the summer, and then you get your new oysters in November, and then we start the cycle, which goes on until early summer, like July is when we release them this year. So it's a good cycle.
Any other questions for myself or Craig? Well, you can always reach myself. Again, my name is Holly Abeels, through Florida Sea Grant. And also, please, if you are interested in oyster gardening or becoming an oyster gardener, to look at the Brevard Zoo's Restore Our Shores program and become a volunteer. So you can go to the website restoreourshores.org. And of course, Florida Sea Grant and University of Florida Extension is always here to answer any questions that you might have about oyster gardening or anything seafood related, since we are doing this because of National Seafood Month.
We have a question. Do you want to take it?
Yes, let's take a question.
All right. Dorothy wants to know if you can grow other shellfish this way.
That's a great question, Dorothy. Yeah, I think you could grow other shellfish. One of the things that the Natural Resources Department has thought about, in addition to the oyster gardening program, is potentially growing clams to bring back our hard clam population back to here in Brevard. I'm not sure if the methods would probably have to be a little bit different, because clams usually live in the mud, and so we'd have to see whether or not there would be the feasibility of them being fine with growing in like a habitat like the oysters are. Oysters are pretty hardy, and it takes a lot to kill them. So that's one of the main reasons why we also used oysters, is because they are used in restoration throughout Florida, and they can survive in the habitat for a pretty long time before being put on the reef. So, great question. All right, well, thank you very much for coming out today. And again, my name is Holly Abeels with University of Florida Extension, and I appreciate you joining myself and Craig today. Thank you very much.